The monitor's flatline scream cut through the chaos like a knife through silence, and Dr. Marcus Hale felt the weight of 23 years in medicine settle onto his shoulders like wet concrete. Room 4017 smelled of antiseptic and desperation. It always did in these final moments. The woman on the bed was 78 years old, her body ravaged by stage 4 pancreatic cancer that had metastasized to her liver, lungs, and bones. Her DNR, do not resuscitate, order sat in her chart, signed 3 weeks ago in her own shaking handwriting. "Step back," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made residents freeze mid-motion. "All of you, step back from the bed." Sarah Chen, a night shift nurse with 6 years under her belt at Providence Memorial Hospital, looked up from where she'd instinctively positioned her hands over the patient's chest. Her dark eyes met Marcus's, and he saw the question forming before she spoke it. "Dr. Hale, her daughter just called. She said her mother changed her mind yesterday about the—" "The daughter isn't here," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "The legal document in this chart is what we follow, not phone calls, not second-hand conversations, not wishes communicated through family members at midnight when we can't verify anything." He looked around the room at the 3 nurses, the young resident whose name tag read Dr. Patel, and the respiratory therapist frozen with an ambu bag in his hands. "This patient has a valid DNR. We let her go with dignity. No compressions, no intubation, no heroics. Are we clear?" The resident nodded immediately. The respiratory therapist stepped back, but Sarah Chen didn't move. Her hands remained hovering over Mrs. Eleanor Vance's chest, and Marcus could see the muscles in her jaw working. "Nurse Chen," he said, letting his voice drop to that dangerous quiet that every medical professional learned to recognize. "Step away from the patient." The Portland rain hammered against the 4th-floor windows, turning the November night into a watercolor of streetlights and shadows. Marcus had been awake for 19 hours, managing a hemorrhaging trauma patient in the ER, consulting on 2 complicated cases in the ICU, and dealing with the endless cascade of administrative bullshit that came with being chief of internal medicine at a hospital that was perpetually understaffed and over capacity. He didn't have the energy for a nurse who couldn't follow basic protocols. Sarah's hands trembled, but she finally lowered them. "Her daughter was crying," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the monitor's unrelenting tone. "She said her mother woke up yesterday afternoon, completely lucid for the first time in days, said she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to fight, that she wanted more time." "And where is this daughter now?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. "Flying in from Boston. She couldn't get a flight until tomorrow morning." "Convenient." The word came out harder than Marcus intended, but he was too tired to soften it. He'd seen this pattern too many times, families who couldn't be bothered to visit until the very end, then suddenly appeared with demands and accusations and revisions to carefully documented wishes. Mrs. Vance signed her DNR 3 weeks ago. She was competent, she was clear. She'd watched her husband die on a ventilator 2 years ago, and she explicitly stated she didn't want that for herself. "People change their minds," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus look at her more carefully. Not defiance exactly, something deeper, something that looked like recognition of a pain he couldn't see. "Not in law they don't," Marcus replied. "Not without proper documentation, not through third-party relay at midnight when the patient is actively dying." He glanced at the monitor. The flatline had been running for 45 seconds now. Even if they started compressions, the likelihood of meaningful recovery for a patient this compromised was essentially 0. They'd break her ribs, fill her lungs with fluid, maybe get her heart beating again, long enough to hook her to machines that would keep her body technically alive while her cancer continued its merciless work. Or they could let her go, clean, quick, the way she'd asked. "Time of death," Marcus said, checking his watch. 23:47. He turned to leave, already mentally composing the conversation he'd need to have with the daughter when she arrived tomorrow. It would be difficult, they always were, but he'd done this before. He'd explained the protocols, the legal requirements, the medical realities. He'd be compassionate but firm, and eventually she'd understand. They usually did. He was 3 steps from the door when he heard it. The soft thump of hands hitting a chest. He turned around so fast he nearly lost his balance. Sarah Chen had moved back to the bedside, her hands locked together in proper CPR position, her body already moving in the rhythm every medical professional knew by heart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus's voice cracked through the room like a whip. "Nurse Chen, I gave you a direct order to—" "Dr. Patel, bag her," Sarah said, not looking up, her voice steady despite the physical exertion. "Rodriguez, get the crash cart. We need epi, 1 milligram IV push." The room erupted into motion. The young resident moved toward the head of the bed, hands already reaching for the intubation kit. The respiratory therapist grabbed the ambu bag. Another nurse, Rodriguez, Marcus's brain supplied, was already pulling the crash cart from its position by the wall. "Stop!" Marcus shouted, but the machine was already in motion. Sarah's compressions were textbook perfect, the kind of CPR that came from someone who'd done it 100 times and knew exactly how much force was needed to circulate blood without pulverizing bones. Dr. Patel was positioning the laryngoscope, his young face set in concentration. Rodriguez had the IV port open, medication drawn and ready. Marcus could stop this, should stop it. He was the attending physician. His word was law in this room. He could physically pull Sarah away from the bed, could order hospital security to remove her, could document this as gross insubordination and have her suspended before the end of the shift. But something in Sarah's face stopped him. Not desperation, not panic. Something else, a certainty that looked like knowledge, like she was holding information he didn't have access to. Her eyes met his for just a fraction of a second between compressions, and in that moment Marcus saw a question that made his chest tighten. What if you're wrong? The thought was unwelcome, intrusive. He wasn't wrong. He had the documentation, he had the protocols. He had 2 decades of experience teaching him that the families who showed up at the last minute with their sudden reversals and their tearful stories were almost always motivated by guilt, not by the patient's actual wishes. But what if? 1 milligram epi, IV push, Rodriguez called out, pushing the medication through the line. Sarah's compressions never faltered. Marcus counted in his head. 90 seconds since she'd started. The monitor still showed that terrible flatline, but he could see the mechanical rise and fall of Mrs. Vance's chest as Dr. Patel squeezed the bag, forcing oxygen into her lungs. 2 minutes. 3. "Stop compressions," Dr. Patel said, and Sarah pulled back, her scrubs soaked with sweat. They all stared at the monitor. Flatline. "Continue CPR," Sarah said, moving back into position. Her voice was breathless now, the physical exertion starting to show. "Another round of epi." Marcus opened his mouth to override her, to end this futile exercise, to restore order to a situation that had spiraled beyond acceptable boundaries. But the words stuck in his throat, because despite everything, despite the protocols, despite the DNR, despite his exhaustion and his certainty, he found himself wondering about the daughter's phone call, about a 78-year-old woman waking up lucid and saying she'd made a mistake, about what it meant to make a choice when you thought you were ready to die, only to discover in your final days that you weren't. 4 minutes, 5. And then, so faint that Marcus thought he'd imagined it at first, a blip appeared on the monitor, then another, irregular, weak. But there. "We have a rhythm," Dr. Patel said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Sinus rhythm, weak but present. Sarah stepped back from the bed, her chest heaving, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb. The monitor showed a heart rate of 42, slow but beating. Mrs. Eleanor Vance's chest rose and fell on its own now, no longer just the mechanical push of the ambu bag. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor and the rain against the windows. Marcus stared at the woman on the bed, at the impossible rhythm dancing across the screen, at Sarah Chen's exhausted, determined face. "Get her to the ICU," he heard himself say, his voice hollow. "Full monitoring. I want labs every 4 hours and a complete neuro assessment in the morning." "Yes, doctor," Rodriguez said, already moving to prepare the transfer. Marcus turned without another word and walked out of the room. His hands were trembling, though whether from anger or something else entirely he couldn't say. Behind him, he could hear the efficient chaos of the medical team stabilizing a patient who shouldn't have survived, who legally, according to her own documented wishes, shouldn't have been resuscitated at all. In the hallway, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Marcus leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. In 23 years of medicine, he'd learned to trust protocols, to trust documentation, to trust the systems that protected both patients and physicians from the impossible grey areas of human suffering. Sarah Chen had violated every one of those protocols. She'd ignored a direct order from an attending physician. She'd resuscitated a patient with a valid DNR. She'd potentially exposed the hospital to a massive lawsuit, opened herself up to disciplinary action that could end her career, and created an ethical nightmare that would take weeks to untangle. And she'd brought a dying woman back to life. Marcus pulled out his phone and stared at the time. 23:52. 5 minutes. That's all the time that had passed between his order to step back and Sarah's defiant compressions. 5 minutes that had changed everything. He needed to report this, document the violation, protect the hospital, protect himself, do his job. But first, he needed to figure out why his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Why the certainty that had guided him through 2 decades of impossible decisions suddenly felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Why he kept seeing Sarah Chen's eyes and the question they'd held. What if you're wrong? The administrative offices of Providence Memorial Hospital smelled like old coffee and new carpet, a combination that always made Marcus slightly nauseous. He sat in the too-soft chair across from Dr. Rebecca Winters, the hospital's medical director, and tried to organize his thoughts into something that resembled a coherent defense. The problem was, he wasn't sure what he was defending anymore. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," Rebecca said, her fingers steepled in that way she had when she was about to dismantle someone's argument piece by piece. She was 62, sharp as a scalpel, and had been navigating hospital politics since before Marcus finished medical school. "You ordered your nursing staff to stand down on a patient with a valid DNR. One of your nurses disobeyed that order and performed CPR. The patient was successfully resuscitated and is currently stable in the ICU. And now we have the patient's daughter threatening legal action because we initially honored her mother's DNR, while simultaneously we could face legal action from the patient herself if she wakes up and confirms that she wanted that DNR honored. Have I got that right?" "That's accurate," Marcus said. The words tasted like ash. It was 6:30 a.m. and he'd been awake for 26 hours straight. After leaving Mrs. Vance's room, he'd spent the rest of the night documenting every detail of what had happened, pulling the patient's complete medical records, reviewing the DNR paperwork, and preparing for this exact conversation. He'd also called the hospital's legal team, who'd been less than thrilled to be woken at 2 in the morning, but had grudgingly agreed that the situation was complicated enough to warrant immediate attention. "And Nurse Chen," Rebecca continued, pulling a file from her desk. Sarah Chen, 31 years old, bachelor's in nursing from OHSU, 6 years with us. Primarily night shift in general medicine, excellent performance reviews, no prior disciplinary issues. She looked up. Until now. She directly disobeyed a physician's order, Marcus said, but the conviction he'd felt last night had weakened somewhere around hour 24 of consciousness. In a critical situation, that's grounds for immediate suspension at minimum. Yes, it is. Rebecca set the file down. It's also grounds for commendation, depending on how this plays out. If Mrs. Vance wakes up and confirms that she did in fact change her mind about the DNR, then Sarah Chen saved her life. If Mrs. Vance wakes up and says she wanted to die in peace, then Sarah Chen violated her autonomy and potentially exposed us to a lawsuit that could cost millions. She leaned back in her chair. Do you see the problem here? Marcus did. Oh, he absolutely did. Medicine was built on protocols because protocols removed the need for impossible moral calculations in moments of crisis. You followed the documentation. You trusted the systems. You made decisions based on evidence and established procedures, not on gut feelings or third-hand reports from family members who might be motivated by guilt or grief or any number of other factors that had nothing to do with the patient's actual wishes. Except sometimes the system got it wrong. The daughter arrived an hour ago, Rebecca said, checking her computer. Samantha Vance, 43, lives in Boston with her husband and 2 kids. According to her statement to our patient advocate, she spoke with her mother on FaceTime yesterday afternoon. That would be Tuesday, around 2 p.m. our time. She claims her mother was lucid, coherent, and explicitly said she'd made a mistake signing the DNR. That she wanted to fight, that she wanted to see her grandchildren one more time. And yet she didn't immediately contact the hospital to update the legal documentation, Marcus pointed out. She didn't call our medical records department. She didn't speak to anyone with the authority to actually modify the DNR. She called the nursing station at midnight, right as her mother was coding. She called several times throughout the evening, Rebecca corrected, reading from her screen. First call was at 7:15 p.m., asking about her mother's condition. Second call at 9:30 p.m., stating that her mother had changed her mind about the DNR. Third call at 11:40 p.m., requesting to speak with the attending physician. That call was routed to you, but you were in the middle of trauma surgery at the time. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. I never got that message. No, you didn't, because by the time you came out of surgery, Mrs. Vance was coding. Rebecca's voice was neutral, but Marcus could hear the implication. The system had failed. Not just Sarah Chen's defiance, not just the ambiguous wishes of a dying patient, but the actual practical system that was supposed to ensure communication between doctors and families. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now, Rebecca said, we wait for Mrs. Vance to wake up. If she wakes up. The neurologist did her assessment an hour ago. There's brain activity, but it's too early to know if there's been any damage from the hypoxia. Best case scenario, she's fully lucid and can tell us what she actually wants. Worst case. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Worst case, Eleanor Vance lingered in some twilight state between life and death, unable to communicate, while lawyers argued over whether saving her life had been an act of mercy or an act of assault. In the meantime, Rebecca continued, Sarah Chen is suspended pending investigation, paid leave, not termination, yet because I'm not about to fire a nurse for saving a patient's life until I know for certain that's not what she did. But she's off the floor until this gets resolved. That's fair, Marcus said, and found that he meant it. Whatever else Sarah had done, she'd done it because she genuinely believed she was acting in the patient's best interest. That had to count for something. As for you, Rebecca said, and now her voice took on an edge that made Marcus sit up straighter. "You followed protocol. You made the decision that any reasonable physician would make, given the documentation you had available. But I need you to understand something, Marcus. This hospital is hanging by a thread. We're understaffed, we're underfunded, and we're one major lawsuit away from having to close an entire wing. I can't afford for this to become a headline. Hospital lets patient die despite family's pleas. You know how that story gets told. I know." Marcus did know. He'd seen it happen to colleagues at other hospitals. Complicated medical ethics boiled down to sound bites, nuance sacrificed for outrage. Careers destroyed because someone made a decision that looked heartless in retrospect, even if it had been correct in the moment. "So here's what's going to happen," Rebecca said. "You're going to talk to Samantha Vance. You're going to listen to her story. You're going to show empathy and compassion because God knows this family has been through enough. And if her mother wakes up and confirms that she wanted to be resuscitated, you're going to thank Sarah Chen for her clinical judgment and her dedication to patient care. Are we clear? And if Mrs. Vance confirms she wanted the DNR honored?" Rebecca's expression hardened. "Then you're going to thank Sarah Chen for trying, and we're all going to hope that gratitude is enough to keep us out of court." Samantha Vance looked exactly like Marcus had imagined, exhausted, red-eyed, hovering in that space between hope and grief that families occupied in ICU waiting rooms across the world. She was sitting in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs outside the ICU, a cold cup of coffee clutched in her hands, when Marcus approached. "Ms. Vance, I'm Dr. Hale. I was the attending physician when your mother coded last night." She stood up so quickly she nearly spilled the coffee. "Is she awake? Can I see her?" "She's still unconscious, but stable. The neurologist is cautiously optimistic. But it's too early to know the extent of any neurological impact from the cardiac arrest." Marcus gestured to the chairs. "Can we sit for a moment? I'd like to talk about what happened." Samantha sank back into her chair, and Marcus took the seat beside her. Up close, he could see the resemblance to her mother, the same sharp cheekbones, the same determined set to her jaw. In Mrs. Vance's medical photos from before the cancer had ravaged her body, Marcus could see this woman looking back at him. "I called," Samantha said, her voice breaking. "I called so many times. I tried to tell them that she'd changed her mind." "I know you did. I'm sorry we weren't able to connect before the crisis. The hospital system failed in that regard, and that's on us, not on you." The words came easier than Marcus expected, because they were true. Whatever else had happened, the communication breakdown was real. "She looked at me through the screen," Samantha continued, tears streaming down her face now, "and she said, 'Sam, I made a mistake. I thought I was ready, but I'm not. I want to see the girls grow up. I want more time.' She was so clear, so certain, and I couldn't get anyone to listen." Marcus felt the weight of that accusation settle onto his shoulders alongside all the others. "Tell me about your mother," he said quietly. "Not the patient, the person." Samantha looked at him, surprised by the question. Then slowly she began to talk about Eleanor Vance, who had taught high school English for 30 years, who had raised 2 daughters on her own after her first husband died of a heart attack when Samantha was 6. Who had remarried at 55 to a retired contractor named Frank, who made her laugh and built her the greenhouse she'd always wanted. Who had watched Frank die 2 years ago on a ventilator, his body kept alive by machines long after his brain had ceased meaningful function, and who had sworn she'd never let that happen to her. "She signed that DNR the day after Frank's funeral," Samantha said. "She was so angry, so sure. She said she'd rather die 5 years too soon than 5 minutes too late, that she wanted to go on her own terms, with dignity." She wiped her eyes, but then the cancer got worse, and she started missing things, missing the girls' soccer games. Missing my sister's birthday, missing life, and I think she realized that dignity in death doesn't mean anything if you're giving up life you still want to live. But she didn't change the paperwork, Marcus said gently. She was going to. We talked about it on the phone. She said she'd call the hospital on Monday. Samantha's voice cracked. But then she had a bad night. The pain got worse, and by Tuesday morning she could barely stay awake. When she finally woke up that afternoon, I didn't think about paperwork. I just thought about keeping her alive long enough to make it official. Marcus closed his eyes. The tragedy of it was so clear now. A woman who'd made a decision in grief and anger, who'd reconsidered when faced with her own mortality, but who hadn't lived long enough to formalize that reconsideration. A daughter who'd tried desperately to communicate her mother's wishes, but who'd been defeated by hospital bureaucracy and bad timing. A nurse who'd somehow understood all of this and acted on instinct. And a doctor who'd followed the rules, because following the rules was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of impossible situation. "Can I ask you something?" Samantha said. "The nurse who saved her, Sarah, I think someone said her name was. Can I thank her?" "She's been suspended pending investigation," Marcus admitted. "What she did was a serious violation of protocol. Even if it turns out to be the right thing, she still broke the rules to do it." "Then the rules are wrong," Samantha said with sudden fierceness. "If following the rules means letting someone die when they don't want to, when they've changed their mind, when they're fighting to stay alive, then the rules are wrong." Marcus didn't have an answer for that, because part of him agreed with her. But another part of him, the part that had spent 2 decades learning to trust systems precisely because individual judgment was so often corrupted by emotion and bias and exhaustion, recoiled from the idea that rules could simply be discarded whenever they produced uncomfortable outcomes. "Your mother is getting the best care we can provide," he said instead. "When she wakes up, we'll know more. About her neurological status, about what she remembers, about what she wants. If she wakes up," a voice whispered in his head, "if the hypoxia didn't damage her brain, if the cancer doesn't kill her in the next 48 hours anyway, if any of this matters at all beyond creating a legal and ethical mess that will take months to untangle." "Thank you," Samantha said, "for talking to me. For listening. I know this is complicated. I know you were just trying to do the right thing." Marcus nodded and stood to leave, but as he walked away, he heard her call after him. "Dr. Hale? Sarah Chen, the nurse. She did do the right thing. I don't care what the rules say. She saw my mother as a person, not a piece of paper. That's the right thing." Back in the ICU, Marcus stood outside Eleanor Vance's room and watched the monitors. Heartbeat steady, oxygen saturation good. All the numbers that medicine knew how to measure looked reassuringly normal, but numbers couldn't tell him whether the person inside that failing body wanted to be there. Numbers couldn't resolve the conflict between documented wishes and desperate phone calls. Numbers couldn't answer the question that had been haunting him since last night. What if you're wrong? His phone buzzed, a text from his ex-wife, Jennifer. She'd heard about the incident through the hospital grapevine. She worked in radiology at a different facility, but medical communities were small and gossip traveled fast. "Heard you had a rough night. You okay?" He started to type a response, then deleted it, started again, deleted again. What was there to say? That he'd ordered his nurses to let a woman die, and one of them had defied him. That he'd been so certain of his righteousness that he'd never considered he might be wrong. That he couldn't sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he saw that flatline and heard Sarah Chen's compressions and wondered what would have happened if she'd listened to him. "I don't know," he finally typed back. It was the most honest thing he'd said in hours. "Want to grab coffee after your shift, just to talk?" Marcus looked at the time. His shift had ended 3 hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. couldn't escape the feeling that if he left now, Eleanor Vance would make her decision about whether to fight or surrender, and he wouldn't be there to witness it. "Rain check," he texted, "still at the hospital." "Of course you are," Jennifer replied. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. The hospital will survive without you for a few hours." But would he survive without the hospital, without the structure and protocols and clear hierarchies that told him exactly who he was and what he was supposed to do? He'd built his entire identity on being the doctor who followed the rules, who made the hard calls, who never let emotion override evidence. And then Sarah Chen had shown him that sometimes the rules were wrong. Eleanor Vance opened her eyes 72 hours after her cardiac arrest, and the first thing she said was, "I need to see my daughter." Marcus wasn't in the room when it happened. He was in his office, reviewing lab results and trying to remember the last time he'd slept for more than 3 hours at a stretch. The call came from Dr. Patricia Morrison, the neurologist who'd been managing Mrs. Vance's care since the resuscitation. "She's awake," Patricia said without preamble, "oriented to person, place and time. No obvious neurological deficits. She remembers signing the DNR, she remembers changing her mind, and she's asking for her daughter and the nurse who saved her life." Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. "I'll be right there." When he entered the ICU, Samantha was already at her mother's bedside, both women crying and holding hands while a nurse checked vitals with practiced discretion. Eleanor Vance looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her body ravaged by cancer, but her eyes were clear and focused in a way they hadn't been in the medical photos from weeks ago. "Dr. Hale," Samantha said when she noticed him in the doorway. "Mom, this is the doctor I told you about." Eleanor turned those clear eyes on him, and Marcus felt the weight of judgment settle onto his shoulders. This was it, the moment when she'd confirm what she wanted and either vindicate his decision or condemn it. "You're the one who told them not to resuscitate me," Eleanor said. Her voice was weak but steady. "Yes, ma'am. You had a valid DNR order in your chart, signed and witnessed. I made the decision to honor that documentation. And if that nurse, Sarah, Samantha told me her name is, if she'd listened to you, I'd be dead right now." It wasn't a question, but Marcus answered anyway. "Yes, you would." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hand still clasped in her daughter's. Then she said, "I need to understand something. When you made that decision, did you know I'd changed my mind? Did my daughter tell you?" Marcus could lie, could smooth it over, could protect himself in the hospital and the protocols that had guided his choice. But looking at this woman who'd been given back her life by a nurse who'd refused to follow orders, he found he couldn't do it. "Your daughter called multiple times throughout the evening. The last call, asking to speak with me directly, came while I was in surgery. By the time I was available, you were coding. When I entered your room, I was told about a phone conversation your daughter had with the nursing staff, reporting that you'd changed your mind about the DNR. I made the judgment that a third-hand report, delivered while you were actively dying, with no updated legal documentation, wasn't sufficient grounds to override a clear, competent decision you'd made 3 weeks earlier. So you chose the paperwork over my daughter's word. I chose the documented evidence over a report that I couldn't verify in the moment, yes. And if you'd had time to verify it, if my daughter had been here in person, if I'd woken up an hour earlier and told you myself." Marcus met her gaze. "Then I would have torn up the DNR and coded you myself." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I believe you. I believe you thought you were doing the right thing, protecting my autonomy, honoring my wishes, preventing the kind of prolonged dying that I watched my husband go through." She paused, her breathing labored. "But I also need you to understand something. When I signed that DNR, I was angry. I was grieving. I was so focused on not dying the way Frank did that I didn't think about whether I was actually ready to die at all. I thought I was making a choice about dignity, but really, I was making a choice about fear. "And on Tuesday afternoon?" Marcus asked quietly. "On Tuesday afternoon, I woke up and realized that I still had things I wanted to do, stories I wanted to tell my grandchildren, gardens I wanted to plant, mornings I wanted to see. The cancer is killing me. I'm not naive about that. But dying 2 days from now is different from dying 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks is enough time to say goodbye properly, to make sure my girls know how proud I am of them, to finish the quilt I've been working on for Samantha's youngest." Her voice broke. 3 weeks is enough time to matter. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. All his certainty about protocols and documentation and evidence-based medicine, all his conviction that he'd made the right call, it all crumbled in the face of this woman's simple truth. She hadn't wanted to die with dignity. She'd wanted to live long enough to love the people she'd leave behind. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate. "I'm sorry I didn't find a way to verify your wishes. I'm sorry the system failed you." "The system didn't fail me," Eleanor said firmly. "The system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. You followed the rules. You protected my documented autonomy. You made the difficult decision that doctors are trained to make. The system worked fine." She paused. "But Sarah Chen saw past the system to the person. That's what saved me." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Marcus said. And now the real reason for his visit pressed forward. "Sarah is suspended pending investigation of her actions. The hospital has to determine whether she acted appropriately in defying a physician's order and resuscitating a patient with a DNR. What she did could be seen as heroic, or it could be seen as a dangerous violation that put the hospital at legal risk. The outcome depends partly on your testimony about your wishes." "Are you asking me to lie?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. "No, I'm asking you to be clear. Did you want to be resuscitated when you coded on Tuesday night?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "I did. I wanted every possible chance to stay alive long enough to do the things I needed to do. If I'd been conscious when my heart stopped, I would have begged for CPR. I would have demanded it. Sarah Chen understood that somehow, even when the paperwork said otherwise. Then I'll include that in my report to the medical board. Sarah's actions, while technically a violation of protocol, were in accordance with your actual wishes as expressed to your family and later confirmed by you directly. That should be enough to clear her." "Should be?" Samantha cut in. "She saved my mother's life. She should be getting a medal, not an investigation." "She defied a direct order from an attending physician," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow now. "In medicine, that's not something we can simply overlook, even when it produces a positive outcome. If we allow nurses to override physician judgment whenever they disagree, the entire hierarchical structure that keeps patients safe falls apart." "But what if the physician's judgment is wrong?" Eleanor asked. "What if the hierarchy is protecting the wrong thing?" It was the same question Sarah Chen's eyes had asked him 3 nights ago. "What if you're wrong?" And Marcus still didn't have a good answer. He found Sarah Chen in the hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m., sitting alone with a cup of coffee and a 1,000-yard stare that Marcus recognized from his own reflection. She looked up when he approached, and he saw the flash of defiance in her eyes before it was carefully masked. "Dr. Hale, can I sit?" She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I assume this is about the suspension." "Partially. I also wanted to update you on Mrs. Vance's condition. She's awake, neurologically intact. She confirms that she wanted to be resuscitated. You saved her life. Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief so profound that Marcus realized she'd been carrying the weight of uncertainty since the moment she'd started those compressions. "Thank God," she whispered. "She asked to see you," Marcus continued, "to thank you personally. I told her you were suspended pending investigation, but I think once we get through the administrative process, we can arrange a meeting." "And the investigation? What's the likely outcome?" Marcus considered his words carefully. "You violated protocol. That's indisputable. You defied a direct order from an attending physician in a critical situation. Even with a positive outcome, those are serious infractions. The hospital has to address them." "I know." Sarah's voice was steady. "I knew what I was doing when I started compressions. I knew what it could cost me, but I also knew—" She stopped, struggling for words. "I knew that woman didn't want to die. I could feel it, and I couldn't live with myself if I let her go without trying." "How did you know?" Marcus asked. "I had the documentation, I had the evidence, I had the protocols. What did you have that I didn't?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "My mother died 6 months ago, ovarian cancer. Stage 4, metastatic, no hope of recovery. She signed a DNR, very clear, very deliberate. Said she didn't want to spend her last days on machines." She paused, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "But 3 days before she died, she woke up and grabbed my hand and said, 'I changed my mind. I'm not ready.' I called the doctor. I begged them to update the DNR. They said she wasn't competent to make that decision anymore, that the morphine was affecting her judgment, that her original wishes were clear." Marcus felt ice settle in his stomach. "What happened?" "She died the next day, peacefully, according to the hospice nurse. But I'll never know if that's what she really wanted, there at the end, if she was grateful for the peaceful death or angry that we didn't fight harder, if honoring her documented wishes was the right thing, or if we abandoned her when she needed us most." Sarah's eyes met his, and Marcus saw the pain there, raw and unhealed. "When I heard Mrs. Vance's daughter on the phone, describing exactly what I'd gone through, I couldn't do it again. I couldn't let another woman die wondering if we'd listened to her daughter, so I didn't. Sarah, I know it was wrong, from a protocol standpoint. I know I put you in an impossible position. I know I could lose my license over this. But if I had to make the choice again, I'd make the same one. Because I've lived with the weight of not fighting hard enough, and I can't carry that twice." Marcus understood then. The certainty in Sarah's eyes, the willingness to sacrifice her career, the bone-deep knowledge that sometimes the rules protected the wrong things. She hadn't just been saving Eleanor Vance, she'd been saving herself from another lifetime of wondering what if. "The investigation will probably result in a formal reprimand," Marcus said carefully, "possibly mandatory ethics training. But with Mrs. Vance's testimony that you acted in accordance with her actual wishes, I don't think you'll lose your license. The medical board understands that medicine isn't always black and white." "And you?" Sarah asked. "What do you understand now that you didn't before?" It was a fair question, a hard question. Marcus thought about Eleanor Vance's clear eyes and her declaration that she'd wanted 3 more weeks to matter. He thought about Samantha's desperate phone calls and the communication breakdown that had nearly cost a woman her life. He thought about his own certainty that following protocols was always the right choice, and how that certainty had nearly resulted in a death that could have been prevented. "I understand that documentation can't capture the complexity of human wishes," he said slowly, "that a decision made in grief and anger might not be the same as a decision made with clarity and hope. That the person we are when we're healthy and planning for death might not be the same person we are when we're actually dying and running out of time." He paused. I also understand that I made the best decision I could with the information available to me at the time, and that it was still nearly the wrong decision, and I'm not sure how to reconcile those two things. Welcome to nursing, Sarah said with a tired smile. We live in that reconciliation every day, following orders that we know are wrong, staying silent when we want to advocate, learning that sometimes the best patient care means breaking the rules. She stood, picking up her coffee cup. Thank you for telling me about Mrs. Vance. It means more than you know. Marcus watched her walk away, shoulders straight despite the exhaustion, and felt the weight of the past 72 hours settle into his bones. He'd been so certain, so sure of his righteousness, and he'd been saved from his own certainty by a nurse who understood that sometimes the most human thing you could do was refuse to let someone die. His phone buzzed. Another text from Jennifer. Still at the hospital? Yeah, he typed back. You can't save everyone, Marcus. Sometimes you have to save yourself first. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He'd spent 23 years learning to be a doctor, learning to make impossible decisions, learning to trust systems and protocols, because individual judgment was too fallible, too corrupted by emotion and exhaustion. And now he had to learn something harder. He had to learn when to break the rules. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the hospital auditorium facing 40 medical residents and a handful of attending physicians for the monthly Morbidity and Mortality Conference, the M&M, where doctors dissected their mistakes and near misses in brutal, necessary detail. He'd presented at these conferences dozens of times, usually walking through cases with the detached clinical precision that medical education demanded. But today felt different. Today, he was dissecting himself. The case I'm presenting involves a 78-year-old female patient with stage 4 pancreatic cancer who coded on the night of November 19th, Marcus began, his PowerPoint displaying Eleanor Vance's chart, de-identified. But everyone in the hospital knew the case anyway. The patient had a valid DNR order signed 3 weeks prior to the event. When she arrested, I ordered the medical team to honor that DNR and refrain from resuscitative efforts. A nurse on my team defied that order and performed CPR. The patient was successfully resuscitated. He paused, letting the murmurs ripple through the audience. This was the part where he was supposed to defend his decision, to explain why he'd followed protocol, to position himself as having made the correct medical judgment regardless of outcome. That's how M&M conferences worked. You presented the facts, you defended your reasoning, you learned what could be done better next time, but Marcus found he couldn't do it. I made the right call. There he continued. According to every protocol, every guideline, every legal standard we have in place to protect patient autonomy and physician judgment, I also almost killed a woman who desperately wanted to live. And I need to talk about why that happened and what it means for how we practice medicine. The room went silent. Dr. Rebecca Winters, sitting in the front row, raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. The patient's daughter had called multiple times throughout the evening, reporting that her mother had verbally rescinded the DNR during a lucid conversation earlier that day. Those calls weren't properly routed to me due to a communication breakdown while I was in surgery. When I was informed of the daughter's report during the code, I made the judgment that a third-hand account delivered during a crisis with no updated legal documentation wasn't sufficient to override a clear DNR signed by a competent patient. Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing the timeline of events. By every standard we teach, I was correct. We followed documentation, not family reports. We protect patient autonomy as expressed in legal documents, not as filtered through relatives who might be motivated by guilt or grief. We make decisions based on evidence, not emotion. He looked out at the residents, seeing his younger self in their attentive faces. But here's what we don't teach: what to do when the documentation is wrong. When a patient makes a decision in crisis and then changes their mind, when the system we've built to protect autonomy becomes the thing that violates it. A hand went up. Dr. James Peterson, one of the senior attendings in cardiology. Are you suggesting we should override DNR orders whenever a family member claims the patient changed their mind? Because that's a recipe for chaos and lawsuit. No, Marcus said. I'm suggesting we need better systems for capturing real-time changes in patient wishes. I'm suggesting that a DNR signed 3 weeks ago should trigger a conversation every time that patient is admitted, not a default assumption that their wishes haven't changed. I'm suggesting that when a family member makes a claim about verbal rescission, we should have a protocol for emergency verification that doesn't rely on whether the attending physician happens to be available at that exact moment. He clicked to the next slide. I'm also suggesting that we need to talk about the role of clinical judgment when protocols fail, because in this case, a nurse with 6 years of experience understood something I didn't, despite my 23 years of training. She recognized that the daughter's distress wasn't generic family guilt. It was specific, detailed, and credible. She made the decision to trust that judgment over documented orders. She violated a direct order from an attending physician, another voice called out. That's not clinical judgment, that's insubordination. It's both, Marcus said. And we need to grapple with what that means, because if we create a system where nurses can never override physicians, we lose the benefit of their frontline assessment and patient connection. But if we create a system where anyone can override documented wishes based on intuition, we destroy the protections that keep vulnerable patients safe from coercion. Rebecca stood up. Dr. Hale, what's the takeaway here? What's the lesson for these residents? Marcus took a breath. This was the moment, the point where he either defended the old certainties or acknowledged that certainty itself was sometimes the enemy of good medicine. The lesson is that being right isn't the same as doing right. I was correct by every metric we measure. I followed protocol. I protected documented autonomy. I made a defensible medical decision. And I was still wrong because the protocols didn't account for the complexity of this particular human situation. The lesson is that we have to be humble enough to recognize when our systems fail, and brave enough to question our own certainty when evidence suggests we might be missing something. He looked directly at the residents now. You're going to face situations where the right answer, according to protocols, is the wrong answer for the patient. You're going to have to choose between following the rules and breaking them. And I can't tell you how to make that choice because it's going to be different every time. But I can tell you this, when you make those decisions, make them eyes wide open, understand what you're sacrificing and why, and be prepared to defend your choice, not with certainty, but with humility. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, one of the residents started clapping. Others joined in. Not everyone. Marcus could see disapproval on some faces, concern on others. But enough. Enough to tell him that something had shifted. Eleanor Vance died 6 weeks after her resuscitation in the early morning hours of a clear January day. She'd made it to Christmas, seen her granddaughters open the presents she'd meticulously wrapped, finished the quilt she'd been working on, and spent her final days surrounded by family in hospice care. When she slipped away, it was peacefully, without machines or drama, exactly the kind of death she'd originally wanted, except she'd gotten 6 more weeks first, 6 weeks that mattered. Marcus attended the funeral, standing in the back of the small church in northeast Portland, while Samantha gave a eulogy that had half the congregation in tears. She spoke about her mother's strength, her wisdom, her fierce love for her family, and she spoke about the gift of those final weeks, the conversations they'd had, the memories they'd made, the closure they'd found. My mother taught English for 30 years, Samantha said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. She always said that the most important lesson she tried to teach her students was that life is revision, that you write your first draft, and then you read it, and you find the places where you got it wrong, and you make it better. She lived that way too. She made a decision about how she wanted to die, and then she revised it. She chose differently, and because a brave nurse named Sarah Chen trusted her daughter's voice, and my mother's changed heart, she got to make that revision matter. After the service, Marcus found Sarah standing alone near the back, her hands clasped in front of her face composed, but her eyes wet. "You came," Marcus said. "I had to. I needed to know." She trailed off, then tried again. "I needed to know that those 6 weeks meant something, that it wasn't just prolonging death, but actually giving her life." "They meant everything," Marcus said. "To her family, certainly, but I think to her too. She got to finish what she needed to finish." Sarah nodded, silent. Then, "I got the results of the board investigation yesterday. Official reprimand, mandatory ethics training, 6-month probation. But I keep my license." "That's fair," Marcus said, and meant it. "Dr. Winters told me something when she delivered the decision. She said that the hospital was updating its protocols, that they're implementing a new system for emergency verification of DNR status when family members report verbal rescission, that every DNR will trigger an automatic review conversation within 24 hours of admission, that they're creating a clear escalation path for nursing staff who have concerns about documented wishes." Sarah looked at him. She said, "You pushed for those changes. The system failed," Marcus said simply. "Not just you or me, but the actual system. We had to fix it. It won't fix everything. There will still be impossible cases, still be situations where we have to choose between protocols and instinct. I know, but maybe next time we'll have better tools for making those choices. Maybe next time the communication won't break down. Maybe next time a patient who changes their mind will have a clear path to make that change official." He paused. "It won't be perfect. Medicine never is, but it can be better." They stood together in companionable silence, watching as mourners filtered out of the church, sharing memories and tears, and the particular kind of closure that comes with a death that feels timely rather than stolen. "I've been thinking," Sarah said after a while, "about going back to school, getting my master's, maybe becoming a nurse practitioner. I want to be in a position where I can change protocols, not just break them." "You'd be good at it," Marcus said. "You have the clinical judgment and the courage to question authority when it matters." "I learned from the best," Sarah said, and there was a teasing edge to her voice. "Watching you present that M&M case, admitting you were right and wrong at the same time, that took guts." "It took perspective," Marcus corrected. "And I got that perspective from watching you make an impossible choice and live with the consequences. We learned from each other." Samantha emerged from the church and spotted them. She walked over, her face showing the exhaustion of grief and planning and endless logistics that came with death, but also something else. Peace, maybe, or at least acceptance. "Thank you for coming." She said to both of them. "And thank you for those 6 weeks, for the chance to say goodbye properly, for the gift of time." "Your mother was remarkable," Marcus said. "I'm sorry we didn't meet under better circumstances." "But you did learn from her, didn't you?" Samantha asked. "Both of you, she'd like that. She always said that teaching was about changing people, helping them see the world differently. I think she taught you both something important." She was right. Eleanor Vance had taught Marcus that certainty was a comfort but not always a guide. That being right according to the rules didn't mean being right in reality. That humility in the face of complexity was more valuable than unwavering conviction. And she'd taught him one more thing, that 6 weeks could be enough time to matter. Enough time to finish a quilt, to hug your grandchildren, to look your daughter in the eye and say the things that needed saying. Enough time to revise your story one last time before the final period. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the hospital parking lot at the end of a 14-hour shift, looking up at the building where he'd spent most of his adult life. Providence Memorial Hospital, with its glowing windows and constant hum of urgent humanity, had been his purpose for 2 decades. But lately, he'd been feeling the edges of something else. Not burnout exactly, more like evolution. His phone buzzed, a text from Jennifer, who'd somehow become a regular presence in his life again over the past months. Not a reconciliation, too much water under that bridge, but a friendship built on shared history and mutual understanding. Dinner, that new Ethiopian place on Division? Marcus smiled. 6 months ago, he would have said he was too busy, too tired, too consumed by work to make time for anything else. But Eleanor Vance had taught him about revision, about recognizing when your first draft needed changing. 7:30, he texted back. Perfect. And Marcus, proud of you for leaving at a reasonable hour. He looked back at the hospital one more time. Inside those walls, doctors and nurses were making impossible decisions, following protocols, questioning authority, breaking rules, saving lives, accepting deaths, and navigating the infinite grey areas between what the textbook said and what real humans needed. He'd been so certain once that there was a clear path through all of it. Follow the evidence, trust the systems, make the hard calls. But he'd learned, through pain and humility and the wisdom of a dying woman and a defiant nurse, that sometimes the path wasn't clear, that sometimes you had to choose between being right and doing right, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you didn't have all the answers. Sarah Chen had gone back to school, just as she'd said she would. She was excelling, according to her professors, bringing a combination of clinical expertise and ethical awareness that was rare in students her age. In a few years, she'd be making protocol decisions instead of just following them. The hospital would be better for it. The revised DNR protocols had been implemented hospital-wide. They weren't perfect, no system could be, but they were better. More responsive to the reality that people change their minds, that wishes expressed in health might differ from wishes expressed in illness, that families deserved to be heard even when they couldn't produce paperwork. And Marcus himself? He was learning to practice medicine with a little less certainty and a little more wisdom, to trust his judgment while remaining open to the possibility that he might be wrong, to follow protocols while staying alert for the moments when protocols failed the humans they were meant to protect. It was uncomfortable, it was exhausting, it required a level of nuanced thinking that was harder than simply following rules. But it was also better medicine, more human medicine. The kind of medicine that recognized that every patient was a person with a complicated story, not a collection of symptoms and documentation. As he drove home through the Portland rain, Marcus thought about all the patients he'd treated over 23 years, the ones he'd saved and the ones he'd lost, the decisions he'd gotten right and the ones that still haunted him. And he thought about Eleanor Vance, who'd given him one of the greatest gifts a patient could give a doctor, the opportunity to be wrong and learn from it. 6 weeks. That's all she'd gotten. 6 weeks between her resuscitation and her peaceful death. But in those 6 weeks, she'd changed protocols that would affect thousands of future patients. She'd inspired a nurse to pursue advanced education. She'd forced a doctor to question his certainties. 6 weeks was enough time to matter after all. Marcus pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet car. Tomorrow, he'd be back at the hospital, making impossible decisions, navigating ethical grey areas, trying to do right by patients who deserved better than a medical system that reduced them to documents and protocols. But tonight, He was going to have dinner with his ex-wife and maybe talk about something other than medicine. Tonight, he was going to practice the kind of revision that Eleanor Vance had taught him was possible. Tonight, he was going to remember that being human meant accepting uncertainty, embracing humility, and trusting that even when you got it wrong, there was always the possibility of making it right again. He looked up at his house, small, quiet, empty except for him, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not resolution exactly, but something close to it, something that felt like peace. And in the morning, when he went back to the hospital, he'd carry that with him. The knowledge that he didn't have to have all the answers, that certainty was less important than compassion, that sometimes the best thing a doctor could do was listen to a nurse who knew better, that sometimes the rules were wrong, and breaking them was the only right thing to do. Eleanor Vance had revised her story in those final 6 weeks, and Marcus Hale had learned to revise his own understanding of what it meant to be a healer. It was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow, miraculously, it was.